Well, I first just want to thank thank you, David, and thank you to the committee very much for this very kind invitation. I remember very fondly when I was at the London School of Economics a number of years back now, going to the IHR and listening to a number of these talks. So it's a real honor to be invited, and I'm just sorry we can't do this in person and all go for a beer afterwards, but one day maybe we'll be able to do this. So the title of the talk is The Politics of Time from a Historical Perspective, but as anyone who reads Koselleck closely, it's the German historian, it's always important when talking about time to pluralize it. So it's the politics of times. And I'm also going to be looking at a number of different historical perspectives, more than just Koselleck. So I'm going to be looking at this from two sides, really. The first part of the talk is how we study different political uses of time and history in the past, what I call, and I've written about this in some of my previous work, the different modes of the politics of time. But I also want to, in the second half, slightly longer second half of the talk, I want to talk about an ongoing conversation, particularly among historians interested in history and theory, about what is known as our historical present, about where we are at the moment and going into the future in terms of the historical discipline, but in particular, the political implications for that and what a number of these theorists of history are saying about the political. Okay, did that slide go through? Okay, good. So I just wanted to begin here with this number of books. We're in the midst of a number of temporal terms in history of political thought and political theory, almost a dizzying amount of temporal terms going on in all different topics, including the history of political thought and some current volume that will be coming out soon, which I will discuss. The variation of the politics of time is, of course, huge. We can start with the politics of clocks and calendars, but also, and in particular, what I want to speak to today is the political use of experiential time and historical time. And by that last term, I mean the various ways that we construct history and see temporal experience in terms of a course of affairs, and or also in considering the relationship of the present, our present or a present at some point, to the past and to the future. So within this are different issues of time and history, but also temporality and historicity. So there's sort of an ongoing Heideggerian, Gadamerrian conversation, which we can maybe get into in the Q&A if you would like. And of course, many uses cross the boundary between time as measure on one hand and time as experience on the other. Calendars, for instance, are both chronological, but also experiential in terms of memory and expectation. For instance, markers of reoccurring national holidays are, sort of in the discussion of Rousseau and the government of Poland, for instance. They're narratives of origins. They give a sense of stability or mourning or national renewal. So it's important at the outset to set a stall out here that the politics of time is not exclusively, as it seems to be in some circles, a politics of history, philosophies of history, or historiography. And what is important to stress is that the politics of time, or what is referred to in a number of other places as chronopolitics, is not simply the uses of times, but the political purveying, the ranking, the contesting of different natural, social, cultural, historical, and also many explicitly political times. As Christopher Clark, the Cambridge historian, has put it in his recent book, Time and Power, we can investigate, quote, what happens when temporal awareness is lensed through the structures of power. But what I would add, and I think Chris does this in his book, is that also from the standpoint of a varied landscape of times that are already within the political. These are times of secession, elections, orders of parliamentary debate. So politics itself as an activity already has a rich ecosystem of times that influence its own temporalization of politics and politics of time. Another recent book, this is edited by Daniel Edelstein and a number of others, this time called Power and Time, refers to a clash of various temporal orders, way of organizing time in different ways, into what they term regimes, time frameworks, that are part and parcel of politics, as they suggest. And this includes time regimes of prophecy, prognosis, labor time, religious orderings of time, and so forth. And this idea of moving from just orderings to regime is important because it infuses this ordering with a sense of political power being made. But again, and I will return to this at the end, I want to stress that the studying the theorizing of the politics of time cannot ignore the restraining, but also the emancipating functions of the times of politics in different historical and institutional settings. And all of these have their own durations, rhythms, and horizons. But the first question I want to pose is, how do we approach this from a historical perspective in relating time and history? A starting point for historians, a rather simple one that I think all would agree with, is to recognize that political thought is not only written and received in time, in different times, but often engaging in the politics of time, plural, and also with questions of transcendence and timelessness going on. So there's often this not dialectic, but this engagement with the purveying of the temporal and the timeless. And this is both at the level of history, and you can capital H this if you want or not, and how politics plays with or explaining our temporal experience in the Augustinian sense and from his Confessions more broadly, and that is the human considerations of past and future from an inescapable present. That this is historical or historicized, where the present is given meaning vis-a-vis the past and future. It's given historical meaning in terms of where we are versus where we've been and where we're going. And much of this has to do with the politics beyond the medieval conception of the nunc stans, or what's known as eternal now, where from the vantage point of eternity, it is only God who could witness every moment in the present and thus make intelligible the purpose of events in the temporal or secular world. Now, I think we should be very hesitant, of course, to associate a politics of time to a theory of modernity. But I do so, next slide. But I do so because there was a recent conference, Joanne Paul was there with me, in 2018 at Clare College, Cambridge, where this dynamic between time and history in the modern spoke to themes that were arising from the conference. And its spark, as John Robertson, formerly of the Oxford and Cambridge parishes, said at the start, was J.G.A. Pocock's work. I won't spend too much time on Pocock, maybe familiar to many of you. But in the sense that Pocock began to thematize, although I don't think he extensively typologized sort of a landscape of the politics of time, but the different ways in which time and history were being used for political purposes in Florentine thought in and around the era of Machiavelli. That is, on how politics can give our temporal experience, our human experience of time, as a happening, an instance, or an event, how it can give that as historical meaning as a moment, that is in relation to future and past, in a way that's quite different from our own human temporality. So the first quote on here is that the moment is selectively and thematically defined. It is asserted that certain enduring patterns in the temporal consciousness of medieval and early modern Europeans led to the presentation of the Republic and the citizens' participation in it, and constituting a problem in historical self-understanding with which Machiavelli and his contemporaries can be seen both explicitly and implicitly contending. So by discussing temporal consciousness and historical understanding, these two things, Pocock is referring here to the temporal position between the enduring patterns, the existing rhythms of time, the routinized structures of time, of medieval and early modern time, and where the moment marks a cleaving or at least a reassessment of an understanding of the present in relation to the past and future. So the upshot of this temporal awareness and reconfiguration in political thought is it identifies moments that can be chronological, chronos, the Greek word for time, but also in relation to this often mentioned Greek term kairos, that is time that is given meaning. It's not just measure. It is a designated time of significance, but also very importantly, considered a time of action. So the possibilities for such action are signified, for instance, here in the Machiavellian concept of virtue. So here's the awareness of time and contingency in relation to historical considerations. That is, to beginnings, ends, breakages, movement, process, continuity, change, things that we would associate with the writing of history are being politicized. So the second quote here, Pocock writes that a vital component of Republican theory, and once he says here that had come upon the scene, if not earlier, in all political theory, I'm not sure that's true, but we can talk about that, consisted of ideas about time and the occurrence of contingent events within which time was the dimension, and about the intelligibility of the sequence, he says it's not yet too soon to say processes, I'm not sure that's true either, of particular happenings that made up what we should call history. So this is to say that for him, a core component of politics of time is how political thinkers historicize our temporal contingent experience for the purpose of gaining and maintaining power. And this reminds of how the German historian Reinhard Koselleck, someone I've written quite a lot about, also considers historical time from the perspective of agents broader, now what he calls here in a Gadamernian sense, anthropological experience of time within their fields of vision, as we say in Truth and Method. So that is his theory of modernity. Now, this theory of Koselleckian modernity is often very much criticized, and rightly so, but it rests in part on changing conceptions of time and how in modernity actors were no longer basing future expectation, the horizon of expectation, on the space of past experience. But interesting, and unlike Pocock is saying, for Koselleck here, politics does not originate this historization, but a singularized modern philosophy of history becomes politicized. And it does so not in terms of contesting vis-a-vis other historical times or temporal experiences, but the problem that Koselleck was trying to identify, and this is often underappreciated, was that it wasn't contested, it wasn't pluralized, and for him this was particularly problematic, not just for historiography, but for politics. And I'll return to this towards the end of the talk. But I also want to shoehorn Koselleck in here because like Pocock, but in extremely different ways, I hasten to add. He considers issues of politics and history and time in relation to language. And in this case, particular historical and temporal concepts that become prominent in the politicking of time. So here, I won't read this quote, but I think this is quite a key one where he says that through these concepts, time itself becomes a title of legitimation open to occupation from all sides. So these are concepts like history itself, time itself, but revolution, progress, crisis, development, emancipation. Whether or not we want to associate these with modernity, and as far as I'm concerned, is neither here nor there, but it does show that these are well-used temporal concepts that are in politics today, quite powerful ones. Pocock, by contrast, is interested in different languages of human association, as opposed to considering concepts, and that's quite an important distinction. And these languages of association, a legal tradition, for instance, come with their own engagements with history and time that are incorporated in political argument. So they're already existing there and they are politicized in the main. And it's from languages, not concepts, that this forthcoming volume from this conference, which I hear is making its way through the gates of Cambridge University Press, will speak to different ways of thinking about history and time and their political employment. And this is important because it breaks the politics of time in the history of political thought down into specific languages in relation to law, sacred time, narratives of political contingency and opportunity, like what I was discussing previously, conjectural histories, among others. So in a way, there's a similarity here between this idea of time regimes and these different time languages. But my previous work, which I won't go into detail here, is more charitable to Koselleck on one hand, suggesting that we can thematize different ways in which we politic time, in the politicking of time, different modes, as I call them, from his much wider writings. And I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, particularly those what he called a historique, on the different possibilities for writing history and for historical consciousness. So I put together these different modes of the politics of time. And I touch on this because it suggests we need not only think of the politics of time in terms of particular regimes, in terms of revolutionary time, national time, technologic time, eschatological time, etc., but that these modes of the politicking of time are found across different regimes and done so through the use of temporal and temporalized concepts, that is change, crisis, now, but also in Koselleckian fashion, what I would call the temporalization of the non-temporal. By that I mean that there are certain political concepts that on the tin do not seem temporal, liberty, equality, justice, but they're being temporalized in many different ways. So we can speak more about these modes in the Q&A, but I can run through them here. And there may be more, I'd be curious to see what you think. But the first is moments, how actors demarcate instances and durations as events, periods, situations, states of affairs, and gives them meaning through an own narrative, or also folding them into wider background narratives that already exist. What does this event mean in terms of a millenarian conception of time, for instance? The second is boundaries. How do actors break and delimit durations of time, establishing origins and ends, separating time between old and new, the past and the future? The theory of modernity would be one of these. The third is horizons, how actors demarcate the scope of political action. Do we prioritize short-term or long-term, but also in this Gadamerian sense, set fields of vision consisting of past patterns of tradition, the relation of the horizons of the space of experience vis-a-vis the horizons of expectation, possibilities, and aspirations. So that tradition itself also has a horizon. The fourth is movement, how actors set and contend with different speeds of change, both internal and external to political activity. And then lastly is transcendence. How do actors transcend or deny contingency, employing the ideal and make claims of timelessness, such as the forms, claims of natural rights, this is our human nature, and so forth. So I'll leave this slide up here for a moment, but I want to sort of leave this, as I said, broader discussion of modes to the Q&A in order to now speak more to a second part of the title on the politics of time from a historical perspective, and that is from the perspective of historiography now, more front and center. And here I want to focus on an ongoing debate among a number of historians on what could be called our historical present, right? That is, what is our historical now? And there's now actually a journal specifically dedicated to this. And what this historical present may be, this may be historicized and periodized in innumerable ways. The mid-20th century, the late 20th century, early 21st century, post-modernity, late capitalism, the Anthropocene. But these are all seen as historiographical problems, but also as such, they are also political problems. And these discussions are so-called historical present is seen as clearly distinct from past historical practices. Past historical presence, excuse me, in that our historical now, so it is argued, is disjointed from a recent and usually a modern past's own historical consideration, usually of the future, as one of openness and expectation. But because of World War I, II, globalization, neoliberalism, you pick, we are now in a new historical present, or what is called a regime of historicity, to borrow Francois Hartog's term. That is different from the modern progressive present as emerged in the Enlightenment. The former was a historical present, which is, as Peter Fritze describes it, a way of thinking about time that dramatized the radical transformations and inserted fundamental differences into history, whereby history was choreographed as an endless number of departures. The loss of the modern time regime, its end of history, as it were, seems to either be something to celebrate or something to mourn. Priya Satya's absolutely exquisite book, by the way, called Time's Monster, is one of the latest criticisms of this narrative of progress and their political employment as a justification for empire and exploitation. But nonetheless, our historical present is still seen as something that is problematic, and it has three particular problems that I want to go into now. The first is the problem of presentism. Second is the problem of exceptional and radical historical change that is happening in our historical now. And the third is what is called a history of the planetary. For a first group of authors, this modern transitory historical present is now replaced by another, one which in this case, Konchowik, as Zellick is saying, is re-anchored in the contested past and now lacks a horizon of future possibilities. On the level of historical thought and consciousness, Hans Grumbrecht describes our chronotope, as he calls it, as our broad present, one that is no longer transitional. As he put it, today we increasingly feel that our present has broadened, as it is now surrounded by a future we can no longer see, access, or choose, and a past that we are not able to leave behind. For him in this present, we lack directed purpose. We are faced with a future that is closing in on us, as if some sort of amid a millenarianism of sort, although there's no specific prognosis to this, which is maybe true of millenarianism as well, to be fair. Nonetheless, we are restrained by the sort of impending doom of the future. The past, in all its mistakes and contradictions, becomes a matter for constant revisitation and litigation. As we've abandoned the future, we seem to be focusing more and more on litigating the past. So a recognition of plurality of past presence seems to engender for Grumbrecht an increased conflict between narratives of historical time. And this historical present is one that is more riven with conflict, he suggests. As such, we are preoccupied with a politics, a way of sort of turning inward, turning towards the now, looking down and back, not up to space and to our open future. To quote him just a little bit more for the second quote on the screen there. When the premise of historical consciousness fell, the historicizing view of human movement through time shifted to the sometimes uncomfortable terrain of temporal stasis and simultaneity. By no means in the early 21st century does the future present itself as a horizon of open possibilities for action. So put in another way, we have lost our capacity for considering our time as one of kairos, a right time for action in the interest of future horizons, at least. Rather, our focus, including our political one, turns to the litigation of the past on one hand, but also simply things like the survival of our species in the present condition on the other. We become obsessed not only with the past, but with the present, and maintaining our current present stasis. Okay, but another concern here is for the historical discipline itself. That is, our historical present brings with it newfound concerns, and I hate to add for some, over this dominance of what is called presentism in historical practice, and the replacement of future expectation with history that is consumed by this inescapable past present, or present past, I should say. Rather than view history in terms of narratives and future expectation, we are haunted by history, as Ethan Kleinberg's book puts it. And the inescapability of the past, the ghosts of the past still being with us, seen for some quite negatively in the need, and I'm not suggesting this is necessarily the case, and I'm not denying the merits of this, to litigate the past from present perspectives. So while this is obviously very much politically charged, we're seeing this in the road statue outside Oriel College, and perhaps necessary, this history of the present past also risks, according to Hartog, being subsumed by the practices and debates around heritage preservation and also memory studies. So for Hartog, our presentism is a crisis in time, as he says, where the future is no longer perceived as a promise, as in modern progressive time, but as a threat and as a catastrophe in the making. As Chris Lorenz has also pointed out, this view is a complete inversion of the modern time regime. As Hartog himself puts it, the West has spent the last 200 years dancing to the tune of the future and making others dance to this tune as well. Yet now the past and future are subsumed in a present black hole of sorts, where for Hartog, history is now dominated by issues of memory, nostalgia, remembrance, identity, and heritage preservation on one hand, and weighed down by a future vision dominated by, if anything, precaution, responsibility, irreparability, and irreversibility on the other. So in this sort of entrapment in the present, as it were, we're going nowhere. So a politics of action struggles under these conditions for something different, as opposed to recognition in litigation. This seems to be the consequence that Hartog is sort of suggesting here. It's not as explicit in his writings. We can talk about this. Okay. Whereas others are absolutely fine to embrace this. Marek Tam and Laurent Olivier, in their recent book, Rethinking Historical Time, I highly recommend this book. This is mainly a Christmas shopping list, by the way, that I'm giving you. Concede that in the new temporal turn, history is no longer what we knew of it. It is now a discipline that studies the living memory of the past in the present, and to reorient not only history, but shape politics in light of a future threatened by environmental catastrophe. This idea of the anthropocene. I won't read this whole quote, but this is extraordinary how we are being called upon to repoliticize history in the age of presentism. The study of history effectively demands that we envision it as a political stance. It gives a voice to active entities that the former regime of historicity had reduced to simple objects. It falls to history, not just politics, as it pronounces testimony in the name of both the human and the non-human to explore new ways of knowledge and creation at the time of the Anthropocene. Okay, but in other readings, I'm now onto my second perspective. The historical present portrays the deficiencies, the impossibility of politics to solve this present historical predicament. In his book, History in Times of Unprecedented Change, Zoltan Ziman speaks not to the domination of the present past, but to what he characterizes as a return of the future, requiring, as he suggests, to rethink historical time and historical practice. His view on the morbidity of past experience as a grounding for coming to terms with our current historical standpoint. We can't understand where we are based on where we've come from, where we were heading. And this is in the face because we are experiencing unprecedented change based on previous historical change. In the face, he suggests, of techno-scientific change in particular, but also the climate crisis. We simply cannot relate to these changes in terms of past historical narratives. And this is a problem for history, he suggests. That's not my main issue. But according to Ziman, he says that it also ushers in a crisis for the political. that speaks to a dissipating steering function of politics, that is, its own attendance to the movement of society as established by existing paths of and understandings of human development, and in particular emancipation. He talks to the politics of the left very much in this section. For the possibility of emancipation in the empowerment of individuals, that is now simply taken out of the hands of the governments in an era of unprecedented change due to natural and technologic forces. In a way, what he's saying is here, we can't base the politics of time on our previous understandings of the politics of time, and that the times of politics are now essentially redundant. So in this new era, politics is no longer the primary governor and supervisor of historical change, and its resources of historical understanding no longer applicable. So to put this in terms of the topos of the politics of movement that I had on the slide earlier, external time flows and ruptures render the internal time processes and the political control over the narrative and understanding of processes of development and emancipation to be insufficient. And there are similarities here, but in some important differences when it comes to a third engagement in the politics of time from a historical perspective, this time in relation to historical reflections on this geologic age known as the Anthropocene, that is now a geologic age that is shaped by human activity, where we are now geologic agents, and that what we're doing now will be in the atmosphere for way too long. And this picture, by the way, is from the Smithsonian's new fossil hall, which has been redesigned around this idea of deep time. Interestingly enough, this fossil hall is also sponsored by the Koch brothers, who made all their money out of oil and gas. So for some reason, they were allowed to get away with this. So rather than thinking of historical time, according to this reason, as something layered on top of natural and planetary times, and historical time, the Anthropocene is a period defined by temporal entanglement, I'm suggesting. And part of the entanglement is that human and natural times that coexisted, that were layered on top of each other, are now encountering each other in new ways. They are now entangled as a result of natural earth processes and human activity coming into even closer interaction. Or at least that it seems within the books from the historical practice in relation to this idea of the Anthropocene, speaks to an increased awareness of our entanglement in an interaction between these times, given that our impact is so much more rapid and visible, and that this is something that historians must address. So in this sense, the Anthropocene is not, in fact, a sort of clean periodization, as I think it was intended by many. It's not a Nauzite in sort of Kozelikian sense. Rather, it is a period of heightened temporal awareness, an awareness of our long-standing, though changing, temporal entanglement with natural processes. And as Deepesh Chakrabarty has also discussed, the Kantian separation between the two, where human time is written upon the canvas of some sort of readily stable time regime, readily stable natural time, is no longer fit for purpose. So rather than in this sense, rather than entanglement, there's a clash, right? A clash of temporalities, of human times on one hand and planetary time on the other, and the one that becomes, as such, a new time regime of the Anthropocene. That is the preference for deep time. This includes the practice of history, that we need to be thinking of history in terms of deep time. And many of these works are then suggesting so does politics. And the Anthropocene is therefore a historical present, haunted in this case not by the past, but the planetary future that reminds us of our human fragility, our reaffirmed naturalness, as it were, and the increasing devastating clash of human and natural time strata. And the problem of the clash of human and planetary time for politics is both spatial and also temporal. The spatial problem, as I see it, and Chakrabarty and others pointed this out, it's not new, is that while the climate crisis has brought the planet into view more than it was before, we don't have a planetary form of governance. And nor does the political usually include any concern, or at least any major concern. Certainly there's no representation for the non-human, the planetary or anything else. So meanwhile, the temporal problem is that we have no other choice to consider, however, the planetary from within human times and the competing and often shorter time horizons that these human times contain. Yeah. But also, this is to suggest that there are other human temporalities that are very important that may get crowded out by a political focus purely on things to do with planetary time. For instance, how do we square a horizon of economic development for the global South, one associated with political conceptions of justice, aspiration, emancipation, when developed countries, themselves of course guilty of a vast amount of carbon being produced into the atmosphere, now claim that a concern for planetary time over human development time must preclude them from enjoying things like air conditioning in the most extreme climates in the globe. They cannot consume meat at Western levels. They cannot take advantage of cheap electricity still provided by fossil fuels. In a way, it's an indisputable fact, as Chakrabarty has pointed out, not without receiving much criticism, that for a planetary perspective, we are fortunate in many ways that a vast swath of humanity has not enjoyed the benefits and comforts that the West has. So it is not simply the time processes of emancipation that politics no longer controls, as is Siemens' argument, but also that we are being told that politics must actually abandon these processes either way, in preference for considering planetary time horizons and flows over human times. Now we can discuss in the Q&A whether or not we can blend these two, right? But there is an argument here that they are irreconcilable, that politics is the problem. And this also means that all of our well-used political concepts that we political theorists and historians of political thought are so familiar with, justice, equality, and rights, need reconsideration on these new timescales as well. Is economic development still just? If so, how fast can it be? How do we reconsider human advancement vis-a-vis its planetary cost, and so forth? And it is these debates are explicitly temporal concepts as well. Development, globalization, progress, emancipation need reconsideration also. Now, political thought may revolutionize. It may already have the right tools for this. From what Michel Serres says, or what he distinguishes between a social contract and a natural contract, where our political partners should now include the non-human and the planetary. Steve van der Heyden's book, Atmospheric Justice, another book I highly recommend, speaks to a new political theory for climate change. But for many others, when you read this Anthropocene literature, and they're usually not political theorists and scientists, politics is seen as the problem. And here's where I want to make a major intervention for the discussion as we near the end of the talk. It's what the collapse of the separation of the planetary and human world times means, is that not only must the political abandon its temporal commitments, its politicking of human times, historical times, cultural times, and things like progress, preservation, and emancipation, but also that the times of politics are themselves being called into question. For a major aspect of the politics of time in the Anthropocene is that political times are the main problem. If it were not for politics and its flawed temporal priorities, we could address the planetary and the non-human far more easily. But dare I suggest that much of this Anthropocene literature only gives really short shrift to considerations of the complicated ecosystem of the times of politics. And we must not be so quick to judge, I'm suggesting, their merits or accepting their degradation in a lot of this literature. For it suggests that we can politicize time in part by rejecting politics as an important time setter in referee. It wants to strip the politics of time out completely, and the times of politics. And these times of politics, I'll just briefly sketch these out, are things like the durations of politics. I put some here on the slide. Election cycles, legislative sessions, procedural hurdles, to do with also the pace of political activity, especially when it comes with democratic regimes, the importance of deliberation, decision-making, listening to different views, regulatory checks. And the political times also include the shortened horizon of politics, which may not always be a bad thing, right? They may not always be anathema to long-term planning. There's a very good book by Alan Jacobs called Governing for the Long Term, where he looks at pension reform. It's maybe not the best Christmas read, but how political agents are actually able to trade off short-term sacrifice for long-term gain in particular circumstances. In short, these political times offer only a rough sketch, but they're all considered in the historical entanglement in the Anthropocene as a problem for action on the timescales that are now required to address the planetary. So our only hope, according to some of these historian circles, and it's not just them, and it's not Chakrabarty as much, I hasten to add, seem to be a form of anti-politics, that replacing of political times with a temporal pace and horizon setters imported from natural science in Silicon Valley. And also this call for slow, when so many populations are getting quite impatient, actually, right? They want to hurry up and enjoy the things that other people are able to enjoy. Sort of hegemonic slowness is also something for the Q&A. In this sense, the scientific and historical Anthropocene concept quickly become, or indeed it always was, a call for a radical temporal reorientation that promotes one particular time regime over all others, in pleas to ubiquitously consider human activity in relation to either deep or planetary time. In these debates, the Anthropocene is marked as a time of heightened temporal conflict, therefore. Just to show this is from a climate protest from a few years ago in Oxford. And I was just standing on the side watching, and I took photos of a lot of the placards. And here you can get a rich sense of the tapestry of the politics of time going on. In this, the Anthropocene is as much a political concept as it is a scientific one, exposing the slippage between its descriptive and normative uses, and one that threatens the place of the political itself. Not only is politics deemed part of the problem, but any attempts to find political solutions are at risk of being deemed futile and at an opportunity cost, given the Anthropocene's apocalyptic narrative. So rather than a moment of kairos, ours is a moment of akiros, a moment for inaction. We are politically paralyzed in the historical present, facing our impending doom. Human time, in other senses, also of little significance on a planetary level. In geologic time, we are a complete blip. So how this can also paralyze politics. We're all doomed. We don't matter. So my main point here is that a historicized planetary time regime risks sidelining politics in its diverse temporal consideration in its own temporal ecosystem. The Anthropocene time regime, even though it's amidst a lot of temporal conflict, it as a regime depluralizes political time. Now, to return to Koselleck, one irony is the way that Koselleck is presented by most interested in historical and temporal politics, including a lot who were at this Cambridge conference, dare I say, is that he's read also as part of the problem in advancing a theory of history based on this idea of a Sattelzeit, a saddle period, that puts a crude reorientation of historical time at the center of a singularized philosophy of history, of one historical time. But this doesn't get Koselleck right. The reality, starting in his doctoral thesis, Critique and Crisis, and also, as I mentioned earlier, in his writings on developing what he called a historique, his theory of possible histories, is that Koselleck is pushing for a response to the singularization of history. He often represents the coexistence of the possible structures of historical time with his own geologic metaphor, incidentally, Zeitschichten, the layering or the sedimenting of time. Along with his use of this Ernst Bloch influenced idea, the contemporaneity of the non-contemporaneous, or the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous, to explain the synchronic coexistence of different time structures that do not necessarily correspond. But now the problem with the Anthropocene, so we're told, is that geologic time risks taking over. Now, Koselleck's metaphor fails to speak to the importance of the contestation of times in history and politics, that these layers are not simply on top of each other and sedimented, but they're interacting, they're conflicting. But nonetheless, in pluralizing historical time, he was at the same time worried about its politicization and singularization. So as I read him, he was not only attempting not only to pluralize history, but to resurrect political times in the plural. For example, with its heavy influence of Carl Schmitt in Critique and Crisis, Koselleck locates the origins of history as a process, as a singularized process, in the Enlightenment, arguing that the 18th century critique of the politics of the absolutist state initiated a dangerous crisis by separating moral idealism from the sphere of political activity. And this starts with Hobbes. Right and wrong is replaced by peace and war. But it replaced the activity of politics with its conflicts and competing interests, with an intellectual pursuit that eschewed dissent in favor of resisting aspirations, of resting its aspirations in rational philosophies of history, which were then repoliticized dangerously in the ideological conflicts of the 21st century. This is hence the crisis. And like Schmitt, Koselleck grounds his argument in the clash of concepts, critique and crisis, and ties it to the conception of politics and the political as a space of essential antagonism and conflict. But unlike Schmitt, Koselleck's normative argument is not simply a call for a reunification. He's not a call for a reunification of morality and politics. Right? That's not like Schmitt. Or simply a return to politics, that is Schmitt. But a recognition that the value of adversarial politics is that it entertains a range of alternative visions, i.e. different times, that things could be otherwise. In this way, Koselleck moves away from Schmitt, whose theory centers only on conflict, famously in the friend-enemy distinction. But for Koselleck, liberalism is not the problem. Koselleck, by contrast, celebrates politics on the grounds of the plurality and contingency of times that politics allows for, if done properly. For Koselleck, instead of a 20th century history rooted in future prognosis and expectation, the importance of politics and the possibility of things being otherwise concerned a temporal reorientation back to the present, the importance of the political present, not just historical present. The problem was that criticism had, quote, he said, transformed the, this is in Critique and Crisis, right at the beginning, transformed the future into a maelstrom that sucked out the present from under the feet of the critic. In these circumstances, there was nothing left for the critic but to see progress as the temporal structure appropriate to a just way of life. I see these critics would say the same thing about anthropocentric deep time. But this is not to say that for him, the contingency of politics and its times and its different visions of society denies futurity, but at least preserves the possibility of different historical times extending outwards from the present in different directions and at different horizons. In other words, he could be speaking of politicking of the ontology of our present in a similar vein to what these authors discuss in terms of the historicity of our present. So in Koselleck's move away from Schmitt's political solution to historical singularization, we should appraise Koselleck's historique, I suggest, as a new alternative to the singularization of major time regimes, an ontological term that consists of developing a much richer historical and temporal anthropology. On a historiographical level, then, the possibility for writing history in the plural is through coming to terms with varied temporal experiences of historical actors, of their past futures. And that's the main thing I think he's doing in this anthropological term. It's a political move. But this is written in light of the problems of the political present as much as the historical one. So my thoughts here on where we end up is not simply then a Schmittian call for the preservation of the political, though I think it is incredibly dangerous to look for non-political solutions to our historical predicament, but more importantly to the preservation of political times in an impatient age. Histories of our historical now, be they presentist, unprecedented, or planetary, risk devaluing the important temporal rhythms of democratic bodies in particular, and the competing priorities of time that political actors must always balance. The political scientist Klaus Goertz helpfully distinguishes between what he calls a politics of democratic responsiveness and democratic responsibility, sort of channeling Weber. Responsiveness has to do with the pressure of election cycles, which can demand quick action and often should, encourage short-term horizons, dealing with key problems in the now, which is not always a bad thing, and give temporal discretion to political actors, something that Koselleck also thinks is very important. But as Goetz put it, responsible politics follows an entirely different temporal logic. In the first instance, it draws attention to the fact that democratic politics, based on deliberation and the search for stable majorities, if not consensus, is often time-consuming and must be seen to be so in the interest of legitimation. Giving time and being seen to take time are, in democratic politics, often regarded as decisive, both to the quality of the legislation and the legitimacy of the decisions being made. The use of time in parliaments, his main issue, is therefore closely associated with arguments about legitimacy of these operations. Sufficient time for deliberation and argument to take place in regards as the hallmark of a strong parliament, and are the power of delay in a parliament's discretion over its own timetables. Within parliaments, the protection of minority rights in particular, he says, is closely tied to giving time and discretion over the use of the opposition. So my suggestion here is that Anthropocene time, or sort of at its most extreme version, are threats to both. But we needn't try and improve the responsiveness of politics at the expense of democratic responsibility. Rather, and to end here, my claim is that politics in the historical present must, one, address the primary problems of the present future. Politics cannot only be about the present and the past. And two, that a historical present, a contested time in itself, as I should have said much earlier, defined by geologic time cannot abandon and should not try and abandon the times of politics and the important ongoing politicking of time. Thank you very much.